Welcome to The Homeless Conservative, a show about principled politics for exhausted citizens. I'm Blake Fisher, and I'm a political junkie so that you don't necessarily have to be. Although if you are a political junkie, 2024 is either the pure, uncut dope, or it's cut with fentanyl and will kill us. I don't know. We don't know yet. It's hard to tell. It's already kind of turning out to be a crazy year, and we're only in April. I don't know. We're halfway to November, I guess. 7 months till November. We'll see what happens, but I know you've got a lot of things competing for your attention, so I appreciate you spending a little time with me if you're folding your socks or whatever you happen to be doing while listening to this podcast. Today we're going to talk about Iran's attack on Israel, or attempted attack, I guess. It didn't really work out as well as they wanted it to be. And we'll also talk a little bit about the Trump trial that started this week. We finally have Trump in court after years of talking about his alleged criminal actions. We get to New York this week where he has to sit through jury selection. And I think Donald Trump was maybe not prepared for how bored he would be at these trials. I don't think it's quite as salacious as he hoped it would be. So anyway, we'll talk about that stuff and let's get started. So the first thing, Iran, we haven't really talked about Israel lately with all the Israel-Gaza war stuff going on. Honestly, it is kind of a slog to get through. There's so much bad information. I feel like our Western media has really kind of from the very get-go been not super honest in the way that they portray all this stuff. I feel like they have done a very bad job at taking Hamas's word as their word. I think that they report what Hamas says numbers-wise and what happened. The best example was the hospital bombing, allegedly, that everyone just ran with. Everyone ran with Hamas's numbers. They said 500 people died. In the middle of the night, we somehow counted 500 people, that it was an Israeli rocket. Turns out that it was a misfire from Hamas that took out, and it hit the parking lot. It didn't actually damage the building that much, and like a few people died. So our press just kind of runs with whatever Hamas says and tends to distrust what Israel says. That's caused a real problem because what I've found is that there's a lot of media that is very much on Israel's side, and then there's a lot of media that's very much on what they would say is the Palestinian side, but by proxy, they're basically on Hamas's side because Hamas is the one running this stuff. So it makes it really hard to figure out what's real, what's not, what's true, what's not. But anyway, I'm not really talking about the Gaza thing so much this week as I'm talking about Iran escalated their actual war with Israel instead of just pretending they're doing it through Hamas and Hezbollah and whatnot, and funding those terrorists. Iran, in retaliation for, basically to catch you up, what happened is that Iran fired over 300 drones, ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles into Israel over the weekend. We got news of this on Friday night, and the U.S. had been warning that an attack from Iran was coming within days. Of course, they said that for a couple of weeks, really. And this was in retaliation for Israel killing, or allegedly, Israel doesn't talk about these things, but the U.S. says it was Israel, and everyone basically knows it was Israel, for killing 3 top IRGC, which is the Islamic National Guard, or not National Guard, Islamic Republic. What do they call it? I don't know. What does it actually stand for? This is something I know, and I can't remember off the top of my head. Anyway, these are specifically the commanders that are in charge of the Quds Force, which is basically the people that organize and fund the terrorist organizations of Hezbollah and Hamas and various other things. And according to Israel, the people that they killed, they're not saying that they killed these people, but they are saying the people that were killed, they believe were directly responsible for some of the planning of the October 7th attack. So this is Israel taking out some commanders in the IRGC to basically prevent future terrorist attacks in their territory. And also 4 other officers in Syria. So this was an attack on, and this is where the media gets tricky. You'll hear some people say that the embassy was attacked in Syria, that Iran's embassy was bombed. It was a consulate building next to the embassy. The embassy was not damaged in it. I guess there was some damage, but not seriously. And this is a consulate building where military generals were planning terrorist attacks. There was also a member of Hezbollah, a leader of Hezbollah, killed in the strike. So Hezbollah's there, and the IRGC, you know what I mean? Like, we don't have to it doesn't take a lot of thought here to figure out what's going on. And so Israel takes them out, but Iran says they've got to retaliate. And we warn Israel that, look, Iran's going to retaliate, and we don't know exactly how, but be prepared for it, kind of thing. So anyway, that's what started this thing. Iran's going to be claiming that this is in retaliation to Israel's strike on their sovereign territory, because keep in mind, Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran tries to keep no paper trail between their actions and theirs, so that they can say plausible deniability, that wasn't us, because it makes it a lot harder to attack Iran. But the truth is, Iran has been attacking Israel this entire time. Jonah Goldberg had a great G-file where he talked about, look, if your neighbor was hiring people to throw Molotov cocktails at your house, but they weren't doing it from their property, would that make you any more okay with it or less mad at your neighbor? No, it wouldn't, right? It doesn't really make a difference if the neighbor is throwing the Molotov cocktails from his property or if he's hiring someone to throw it from the street. No, I would argue that it doesn't. It's a pretty good analogy, right? So that's what Israel's been dealing with this whole time. But this is finally a situation where Iran says, we're going to retaliate as Iran. We're going to send these missiles out of Iran, and they send over 320 cruise missiles and projectiles and drones, sort of suicide drones is what they call them, and because they just basically fly and blow up, right? And so this is what happened. This is not random. Like I said, they use these proxies, as they're called, often like Hezbollah and Hamas, all the time to attack Israel with this plausible deniability. But this time they're going, no, we're actually doing it from our territory. And so Friday night, we get word that that's going to happen. It's going to take several hours for those projectiles to get to Israel's airspace. And in the meantime, don't know all the details of this, obviously, but several allies come to Israel's aid to help swat these things down. So the American, the British, the French militaries, as well as Jordanian, which is not typically an Israeli ally, but their explanation was Jordan is between Israel and Iran, part of it. And so they just said, look, we are going to shoot down anything that goes in our airspace because we're protecting our people, which is actually pretty smart because allegedly half of the projectiles, so 320 about things got sent, like I said, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones, and half of them failed before they got to Israelis' airspace. That's not failed like we didn't shoot them down. That is, they failed. That's not a good rate of failure. That's pretty bad. I think that somewhere in like a 5% range is generally expected. I think that's what ours is less than 5% on our kind of missiles and stuff like that. So this is an over 50% thing, which reminds me of, I don't know if you all remember a few years ago, there were kind of the memes going around because Iran had demonstrated this launch of, I think, intercontinental ballistic missiles or something. And they had photoshopped one of them because one of them didn't go off. There were like 4 missiles and it was so badly, obviously photoshopped. But again, all of our Western media just ran these images without really taking a look at it. It was one of those things where the smoke plumes were so clearly, obviously copied and pasted from one to the other. And so then there were all these great memes of like thousands of rockets going off or a giant cat or Godzilla in the background. It was truly a hilarious thing. So obviously Iran has some bad tech, and they're not exactly, they may look like they've got all their stuff together, but maybe not really. So half of the rockets fail on the way to Israel. And then we managed to shut down the rest of them by swatting them out of the air. Allegedly of those, so like half of them are duds. More than half of the majority of the remainder of them, we shot down. So certainly this is not just Israel's Iron Dome technology that is swatting all this down. Like we swatted a lot of them. Jordan, like I said, Saudi Arabia allegedly helped, French, British. So a lot of people jumped in to say, hey, this is bad, right? Because obviously if this would have been a successful attack, we don't know exactly where they're going. Israel also has technology that can jam GPS signals over the area of their state. So in order to confuse these things, the problem is we don't know exactly where they're all going, but if you fire 300 something projectiles, I'm assuming they're not all going to military bases. This seemed like it was, we don't know, but you have to assume there'd be civilian casualties in this, right? And a lot more. This is obviously not a tit for tat thing. They didn't go after a little military thing where they took out a couple generals. This is, like I said, sending hundreds of missiles into Israeli territory. And so Yeah, so that's a lot. And the IRGC directly funds and coordinates all these terrorist proxies. And because Israel decided to take out some of their leadership, which, by the way, we did in 2020 under Trump, we took out Soleimani during the Trump administration, and Iran was pissed about it, but they sort of promised to retaliate. They didn't really ever retaliate against us so much, but they did retaliate here against Israel and sent, like I said, 170 drones, 120 surface-to-air missiles, and 30 cruise missiles sent over to Israel, and half of them failed, and we shot down the rest of them, except there was one casualty, which is kind of incredible when you think about that, is that there was, and by casualty, it's not even a death yet. There's a little girl, a Bedouin girl, that is a nomad, so they don't have bomb shelters in sort of the southern deserts of Israel, that got hit with some of the shrapnel from one of them that we shot down. So she's in the hospital still. But that's kind of a miracle that we only have one hospitalization, one casualty here out of all of those missiles coming in. That's pretty incredible that we have the technology to do that, right? And, so we've got, that's the situation. And so only five of the ballistic missiles entered Israel airspace. So none of the drones or cruise missiles actually even got into Israeli airspace. They all got shot down before they even got there. So only 5 entered. Like I said, one caused the shrapnel for the girl to get injured. One of them did hit a military base and caused some minor damage, according to Israel. So that's the good news, is that's minimal damage and really no lives lost. One casualty in the sense that we have someone in the hospital who is still apparently in very serious condition. So prayers for her, obviously. But the bad news is this is a significant escalation in the region, right? Because no matter how you slice it, this was Iran firing missiles and drones from Iran. They're not using proxies this time. They're not trying to cover a paper trail of, well, it wasn't us, plausible deniability. This is just Iran saying, hey, we're attacking you. Now, they were telegraphing the whole time before, while the missiles are in the air. They're like, this is it for us. We're like, this will be the end of it. They're clearly trying to telegraph that, like, we're not trying to escalate this anymore. This is just a retaliation for this one thing. I think it's pretty hard to say a strategic strike on a single building that kills several IRGC people. There were a couple Syrian police that were killed, and I think a couple of civilians in the building who were also killed. But that's a pretty strategic and very focused strike. Then you send, over 300 missiles into Israel. I don't know I feel like that's escalation, even though nothing happened. And there's a lot of talk about so Friday night, by the way, this is Friday night, as I get this news, I'm at a birthday party for a friend. And so me and some friends start talking about what do we think this is? Is this, we start theorizing okay, is this just Iran trying to save face because they can't do nothing? And so they're sending a bunch of weapons they know will be intercepted. And that was kind of our theory at the time, because we knew nothing other than they're sending, at the time, we just knew that they had fired, and I don't even know if we knew it was hundreds of weapons yet. I don't know if we knew that part yet, but we thought, well, maybe this is their way to save face with their public in Iran, to say look, we are sending, we are escalating this, we are sending a retaliatory thing, but sort of knowing that we would swat them down and potentially this would not actually cause any real damage or loss of life. That was sort of what we were kicking around, is this just Iran kind of trying to talk tough? There's this interesting thing that goes on in all of politics, but specifically in this sort of situation where you've got an authoritarian government, in the sense that you've got to keep, there's this balance between, you've got to keep your people scared of you in a way, and because there's been a lot of unrest in Iran over the last several years, and so I would imagine that some of the leadership in Iran is kind of scared of their people, and understandably they have to look really strong, because if they look weak, I don't think they're as concerned about an attack from us as they are from the people realizing they're weak and overthrowing the government, for example. And what's interesting is you kind of have to figure out, how do we telegraph that to our people, and at the same time you're dealing with the geopolitical stuff between Israel, between the United States. I'm sure this is very complicated, and I don't know much about this kind of stuff, but it seems weird to me that like that's a hard tightrope to walk, right? We can't necessarily, you can't do nothing because your people will think you're weak, and maybe they'll think you're weak enough that they could overtake you or rise up against you. So that's one thing you're trying to squash. But on the other side, you're trying to, you do think Israel and America are your sworn enemies, and I think they're legitimately, they believe that. I mean, they think we're the great Satan, and they think Israel, they want to wipe Jews off the face of the map. That's enough for me to know that we should take them seriously. But anyway, so Biden, of course, in all of this is saying, don't. That was his one word response when the press asked him, like, what would you say to Iran right now? Should they retaliate? And he said, don't. That's all he said. We'll talk a little bit more about our response and Biden stuff, but obviously it didn't work. Telling them don't doesn't do it, doesn't get the job done. What do you know? So anyway, we theorize, like, what is this? Is this Iran trying to save face? They want to be able to retaliate without escalating the conflict with Israel, because frankly, Israel has nuclear weapons and Iran does not yet, although they think they might in the next 6 months to a year. I mean, they're very close. And you got to look at it from Israel's point of view of, all right, they sent all these in, and what if one of them did have a nuclear weapon and that got through because they tried to bombard with all these missiles and stuff? And I think it's pretty clear that the goal of Iran would be to send so many missiles that I think it's pretty obvious that if Israel had to act alone, that they would not have been able to shoot down all of those. Obviously, we shot down a lot of them. So without a bunch of allies in the region, and even sort of people that are not really even allies, but obviously Jordan, Saudi Arabia, these countries are acting in sort of their own self-interest because they don't want to see an escalation in the region either. There are some reasonable Arab countries in the sense that, like, remember that part of the reason people think October 7th happened, those attacks, is because there were peace talks between Saudi Arabia and Israel, sort of to normalize relations there. And that, Iran does not want that. And Saudi Arabia and Iran obviously don't like each other. And it's this weird thing of the enemy of my enemy is my friend going on. There's a lot of really weird, complicated stuff in the Middle East. And I would love to have a Middle East expert on here because I am not one. But, so basically, that's what me and my friend are theorizing on Friday night. We don't know where the missiles are headed. Are they headed towards civilian targets or military targets? And so we kind of theorize, like, what will happen. Obviously, when they all get swatted down and we see the full scope of it, I think it's pretty obvious Iran thought they'd get past some of the missile defense stuff, and maybe a few would get in and cause some damage. I think the overwhelming number of missiles they sent they would have had to know that all 300 some odd of those are not going to get in there, especially if they knew anything about their failure rate, which I would assume they know, or at least have some idea of the failure rate of these weapons. But half is pretty bad. And so, yeah, you've got to send 320 so that 175 or so can get into actually make it into the airspace. And maybe most of those get knocked down out of the air with Iron Dome or other things, but maybe a couple get through and you get some sort of, oh, look, we did. And by the way, Iran was showing like burning buildings and damage, like propaganda that didn't actually happen, as if like to show their people, look, we did real damage to, which is also hilarious to me. I guess in a dictatorship, you can kind of do that. You can control the media and control what your people see. But they were clearly to me, that shows that they're trying to save face with their people in Iran. And they didn't maybe even really care if nothing happened. But it's got to be embarrassing for them, right? It's got to be embarrassing that not a single one of them, only 5 of the 320 even made it into the airspace. And basically they caused no damage. And their one casualty so far is a little 7-year-old girl. That's not a great look either, frankly. You didn't take out a commander of the military. You took out a 7-year-old girl with shrapnel. That's not a good look, right? And so, I think Iran showed its hand here. What's interesting is that since October 7th, things have deteriorated in America and the West and sort of largely throughout the world, because I feel like everyone's sort of pretending there are 2 sides you could choose between. And what's interesting is that the 2 sides they're saying this conflict in Gaza is about is Israel or Palestinian people. It's rare that I see Hamas in the headlines. It seems like Palestinians, without mentioning Hamas. Hamas are the terrorist organization who are in charge in the Gaza Strip. They are the people that were elected fairly in the early 2000s, although then they just canceled all elections and took over stuff. So this is not that the civilian population in Palestine completely in the Gaza Strip, like these Palestinians don't completely support Hamas, obviously. Now they have pretty high support numbers. And if you look at any of the footage from October 7th, they're dragging, hostages back into Gaza, and there's just citizens like cheering for this and spitting on them and kicking them and stuff. And it's pretty gross. I mean, so there is a portion of the Palestinian population in Gaza that is pro Hamas and pro, attacking Israel and stuff. And to be fair, they've been propagandized their whole lives. They do this in elementary school, and they teach kids to hate Israel and Jews and stuff. So it's a really hard to separate that stuff. But essentially, in the West, what it seems like we've boiled this down to is like you're either on the side of Israel or you're on the side of the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. And we kind of just forget that Hamas started this whole thing by attacking and murdering and raping and doing awful things to over 1,200 Jews. I mean, it's the largest number of Jews murdered since the Holocaust at a single time. So I feel like that doesn't get mentioned enough, that Hamas could end this war, this conflict in Gaza immediately. Now it's come out that in the negotiations, they're claiming they don't even have the number of hostages that we were asking for a ceasefire. They're like, we don't have that many non-combatant age. Because, by the way, if you are an 18-year-old male and you got kidnapped, they assume you're military, basically. And so those are people that aren't getting released. It's women and children, elderly, which is fine, I guess. But it's just funny that we talk about misogyny all the time, and that's a pretty funny one. Where if you're a kidnap victim in Gaza right now, that got kidnapped by Hamas, if you're a male, you're probably going to die there. That's just the facts. That sucks. But obviously, I'm all for the women and children getting out of there first. They're clearly non-combatants. They should be released. But now they're saying they don't even have 40 women, children, elderly, non-combatant age. They don't even have 40 hostages, which means that more hostages are dead than I think we thought going into this. So Hamas is not even really telling the truth about this stuff. But either way, that's beside the point. Let's talk more about Iran. But I think that's an unfair painting of what's going on in Gaza, because we don't talk about Iran being the support system behind Hamas in the first place. That just doesn't make enough headlines, I don't think. And going back to Jonah Goldberg's Molotov cocktail being thrown by your neighbor by proxy, it's funny how often we're just like, oh, Israel should just take this, it's fine. I just wonder, what would United States citizens feel like if Mexico's maybe a bad example. Let's say someone a little further along, maybe it's not Mexico, but someone in Central America is hiring proxy terrorist organizations to attack us constantly. I don't believe that we'd be like, Israelis are basically like these rockets and alerts and these kind of things. This is like a normal part of life for them. I don't think we would tolerate that, and I don't think we'd ask any other country to tolerate that. I think that's insane to me, that they just are bombarded with rocket attacks all the time. And sometimes our administration's policy towards them is like, oh, don't escalate it, though, with Iran. Because, it's not really Iran, it's these terrorist groups. And we're doing the same thing, by the way. I know that I said, we're not getting attacked in our territory, but our military is getting attacked. And right now, the ships in Suez Canal, Hezbollah has been going after them. 3 Marines died a couple months ago in a drone attack. And so this sort of Iran's proxy attacks on us, we've just allowed to happen over and over and over again. And for whatever reason, Obama and now Biden are so desperate to get back into an Iran nuclear deal that they will do absolutely anything. They'll let them get away with anything, including now attacking Israeli civilians directly from their territory, because Biden's response to this has been, let it be. Essentially, he's like, take the win. This is like his exact words are like, take the win to Netanyahu. It's like, you should not retaliate for this. I think normalizing Iran sending 300 missiles or drones from its territory into Israel territory is, I think if you normalize that, I think that's bad. Now, like I said, there are all sorts of strategies here that we could do. I think that they could wait. They could only take out military targets. I think there's all sorts of smart or dumb ways Israel could respond here, for sure. Because they've not responded perfectly to what happened on October 7th. They've done some things in Gaza that don't make sense even militarily. And this is me reading other people's opinions. I'm not a military strategist, not going to pretend to be, but I read a lot of people that go we think this is smart. This is what they should have done. This is, I like to read nuanced stuff of here's why I think this will work. Here's why I don't think this will work. And there's plenty of people now that aren't just knee-jerk reaction anti-Israel that are going, I'm pro-Israel. I think they have a right to respond. And this is happening within Israel too. Keep in mind, I think the most important opinions are those of Israelis who live in Israel. I don't want to pretend that I should tell them what they should do. That's, I think, ridiculous. I do also pay attention to people who live in Israel or have family in Israel or are from there. Because I think their opinions matter more than ours, honestly. But, there is a turning against Netanyahu for sure. There's a lot of people that think he should go inside of Israel, not because they think that they shouldn't retaliate against Hamas. It's just that they don't think they're doing it the right way, and it's being dragged on, and it's being done sometimes in such a way that's turning the world and especially Western allies against them. And they realize they need those allies. Israel absolutely needs allies like us. This attack would not have gone probably as well without Britain and us and France and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and pick them, right? If Israel has to go at this alone, they're not going to survive when they're in a neighborhood with a bunch of countries that want to wipe them off the face of the map, right? So they need their allies. So there can be criticism of how Israel responds. I'm more talking about should they or shouldn't they? I don't know that we should be in the business of, I'm fine with us trying to convince them, but it's especially interesting to me that there's a group of people that think that we shouldn't be offering any military or financial aid to Israel in their fight against these proxies and now Iran. There's a lot of people, especially on the left, that think we should not do this at all. And this is why Biden's sort of in some trouble right now, is because he's trying to thread the needle between doing what he thinks is right. I think personally, I think he actually does want to defend Israel, but his base, he's losing his base, especially young voters who think that we shouldn't support Israel at all. It's super hypocritical, in my opinion, to say that we shouldn't support military action in Israel at all, but then to say Israel shouldn't retaliate for this attack where we helped them swat these things down. So if you got your way, if you're on the left and you say we shouldn't military support Israel at all, and so we didn't intervene this weekend, if those attacks came through and actually killed people, civilians inside of Israel, and they still claimed that Israel shouldn't retaliate, to me, you clearly are anti-Israel. You are not pro-peace. You're not pro-two-state solution. You're anti-Semitic. I mean, frankly, you are expecting Israel to do things that you'd expect no other country to do. And I think we've got to call out that hypocrisy. And so that's my rant on the left. But, so I think to just be pretend that this is, Biden has been so bad. And I think all of this really starts with the Afghanistan withdrawal. I think that our enemies saw after the just absolute debacle that the Afghanistan withdrawal was, that we had a president that was going to try at all cost to just avoid conflict and to not escalate. You hear the word de-escalation, or we're trying not to escalate. You hear that from the White House all the time, and the State Department and all these people. And I think that everyone knows that these red lines that we can't cross, we being our enemies, that we're not serious about it. You look at Russia invading Ukraine. I think China's watching how we respond to that to see what they could do in Taiwan. I think that this clearly gave a green light to Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas to attack Israel further, because I think that they see that we're weak. And I think that our general disposition changing lately with kind of going after Israel more than we're going after Hamas. You hear these sort of platitudes from Anthony Blinken about, he'll kind of at the start of the thing say, let's just remind everyone that Hamas started this and Hamas could end this right now. and he'll kind of spin like it's like a disclaimer at the top of the news. But then he goes off on like, but Israel's not doing this and blah, blah, blah. And Israel needs to do this. And kind of then harping on Israel a lot. And it's weird because Biden's trying to do the same thing Iran's trying to do, right? Except that he's trying to tell his base one thing and then telegraph to the more, the majority of Americans think Israel is within its right to go after Hamas. And so he's trying to talk to those people too. He's trying to talk to like be all things to all voters. Well, I think all he's really doing is pissing off everyone because it's not like those pro-Palestinian, let's call them to be generous. But I mean, I really think you're kind of pro-Hamas now if you're like cheering on the attacks. And by the way, there were people in Chicago when this was announced at a sort of meeting to see. They were trying to plan on how they're going to disrupt the Democratic National Convention because they're very anti-Israel and they're very anti-Biden. They call him Genocide Joe and stuff, which I think is absolutely insane. But these people are they're cheering, there's clapping. They're all about when this announcement comes that Iran has sent these missiles into Israel. And so clearly that's an anti-Israel, I think anti-Semitic, but that's some of the base that Biden's trying to get to turn out in November. I think it's foolish to try to cater to those people who are insane instead of talking to the people who are reasonable in the middle that are kind of like, and I think he could do a better job at just saying, look, Hamas started this. There was a ceasefire on October 7th and they murdered and raped people and kidnapped them and took them. And like, that's what Hamas did. And it's Israel's right to go after Hamas. We think that we'll criticize Israel when we think they need to be criticized and we'll try to help them do it in the right way, but like Hamas should be eliminated, or Hamas could end this right now. I think that should be said every day from the White House that Hamas could end this conflict right now in Gaza, but they're not going to do that. And now he's trying to do the same thing with Iran. He's trying to say, Iran, don't. And then when they do, he tries to tell Israel, don't retaliate. That's enough. Take the win. You lost no life. But I just don't think that's enough. I think I'm fine with Israel deciding for themselves what they need to do in this situation. I hope they do it in a smart way. I hope it's strategic. I think in an ideal world, they would just go after some sort of military target instead of Iran and say, that's it. And also, there'd be also kind of a sort of a victory there of just like, look, we can actually attack you and all of yours failed. Which I think is something to telegraph to the Iranian people, right? I think that's not a bad way to do it. My guess is that Iran was emboldened by sort of the world in the West and Biden, I don't want to say turning their back on Israel, but they've certainly been more harsh on Israel. And it seems like Israel is becoming more and more isolated. And I think Iran thought they could get away with this. I think that they thought maybe we wouldn't come to their aid and that this stuff would get through. So I don't think they were actually maybe counting on us doing this. Like I said, I'm just totally guessing, but there's so many, you really do need to know people's motivations to know how to respond. And so I think it's important that I assume our intelligence does have some of this and it's probably sharing it with Israel. And we're not going to be able to know this as just citizens, but I think the sort of anti-Israel, I would call, like I said, anti-Semitic leftist, the very far left, I think that they're sort of influencing the media and they're framing this, like the Gaza conflict, as this sort of mighty Israel picking on poor Palestinians, because that's this sort of oppressed narrative that they have to have for everything on the far left now, right? Everything's about an oppressor and oppressed, and so that's why they're going to portray Jews in Israel as sort of white European, even though, and they're sort of discounting the fact that like 20% of the population is Arab, most of them are not white looking, and they're not European descent, but they have to have this oppressor-oppressed narrative, and that works if you're talking about Palestinian civilians in Gaza versus Israel, the state of Israel. That does not work as well if Iran, who has, I believe, 85 million citizens versus, if you're looking at just the Jewish population inside of Israel, it's 7 million people. The total population is like 9.5 million. So 20% of the population is Arab. But if you're just looking at the Jewish population, you're talking about 7 million people versus 88 million people, or 85, whatever it is, inside of Iran. Well, that no longer makes Israel look like the bigger, stronger people. Now you can say that Israel's maybe bigger and stronger militarily because they have a nuclear weapon and they have actually better technology that doesn't fail half the time like Iran does. But I think that's part of the problem, is that the reason the narrative is never Iran hires Hamas to attack Israel is because that makes Israel look like the little guy and the victim in the thing. And I think quite a few people on the left don't ever care to see Israel as the victim because I think they're anti-Semitic. I'm not saying that's everyone that's a Democrat's position at all, because when you look at polling, most Democrats are actually on the side of Israel. They say Israel has a right to defend itself. What happened on October 7th is terrible. Hamas should go. They're concerned for how the war is going on and Palestinian civilians, obviously, but most people understand that there's just an unfortunate part of war, especially in urban warfare, when Hamas likes to use civilians as shields and is all for civilian casualties because they get to use it as propaganda to turn the West and allies against Israel. And that's been working for the last 6 months, by the way. And so it's a little harder to paint Israel as the oppressor if Iran, bigger population, wants to wipe Jews off the face of the earth. These are things that are not rational to most of us in the world. And so we go, yeah, Iran's the bad guy. It's clear that Iran's the bad guy in this situation. And so it's, I think, interesting, because if you would have asked me a week ago, I would have said, man, Israel's in a bad spot. They're losing support. They're losing allies. And it seems like by Iran just launching these missiles, there's at least some backing of them now. And there's people that are going, yeah, it's Israel should retaliate or whatever. Like I said, I'm not getting into what they should do. I don't care. I'm not a military strategist. I think the Israeli people should telegraph to their leaders. And I think that the leaders should carefully consider what will help them in the long term, because this tit for tat stuff is not going to work out in the long term, I think, for anyone. But, is this an opportunity for Israel to take out Iran's nuclear program that's not quite off the ground? But like I said, experts think within 6 months to a year, they'll have a nuclear weapon. We got to really think about, I know this was the whole nuclear deal was to try to prevent it, but they were cheating at it, which is why Trump left it. They were like, this is ridiculous. I don't know what Biden and Obama's obsession with trying to appease Iran is, because they're cheating, and they clearly think we're the great Satan no matter what. Now, we have, as of this morning, we've added more sanctions to Iran, so that's good. The White House is actually taking action against Iran already, even if it's not militarily. And maybe that's part of them talking to Israel, is saying, look, we're gonna hammer them with more of these kind of restrictions. That's gonna hopefully put them in a bind financially. And some of that works, but it's kind of long-term stuff that works, right? But I think this has to zoom out to the real problem, though. The other thing that this does when Iran really gets into it is that this is not an Israel and Palestine, Gaza Strip. This is not an occupation situation. This is not just within Israel that there's this problem. Once Iran directly attacks Israel, to me, it makes it more clear that this is an Arabs versus Jews situation. There's a lot of Arabs that want to eliminate Jews completely. And that's specifically Hamas's goal. That's Hezbollah's goal. It's Iran's goal. They don't want Israel to exist, right? This is a century-old problem. This is a century-old war, right? And it's not specific to Israel. This has been those people. Like the reason Israel exists is because Jews got driven out of Arab countries and they got driven out of Europe. And that's why Israel exists in the first place, is because this has been a conflict for a really long time. And this maybe puts that a little bit into perspective, which I think is important to have in mind, because we can't rationalize that as Americans. I feel like we have trouble with that because we don't have a similar conflict. Our Cold War with Russia was about communism versus capitalism. It was a war of sort of ideas of how a country. We have problems with dictatorships. We have, generally our enemies are ideological in the sense that we say we're for democracy, or we're for. Or look, our Civil War even was about ideas. Our Civil War in America was about keeping A, the Union together, and B, like eliminating slavery. That's what it was. We fought a war because some people wanted to keep slavery and some people wanted to eliminate it. So it really did boil down to ideas. It wasn't, we hate you because of your religion or your skin color or whatever. And so I think we have a little bit of trouble understanding that, but that is what the heart of the conflict is. against Israel is that this is not painting all Arabs as Jew hating, but some of these countries are very explicit in that they hate the Jews and they want to eliminate Israel. They're not happy having just driven them out of their Arab countries and out of Europe. I don't know where they want to drive them to, but it seems like they want to get rid of them entirely, right? And so I think that puts this into light, and it makes it a little bit harder to, I think, defend if you're on the far left, because, like I said, this turns into an anti-Jewish situation and not so much an anti-Israel. Everyone always tries to paint this as like, I'm anti-Zionist, right? That's like the way that the left says it, and you'll see that all the time. Zionist is I am pro-Israel having a state, or I'm anti-Israel having a state. But I think you've got to ask, like, where do you want them to go? Do you want them to have a country at all? Do you think we should just disperse them somewhere else? We've been doing this for centuries with Jewish people, and to me, that very much plays into, well, it's obviously you're anti-Jewish. This is anti-Semitic in nature, right? You're painting it with a pretty word of anti-Zionist, but that doesn't mean anything to me if you don't think Israel can exist. Like a two-state solution, if we're talking about that with Palestine and Israel, we can have that discussion. But do you know who keeps offering that and who keeps rejecting it? Israel is the one that keeps making concessions to have a two-state solution, and the Palestinian leadership, whether it was Yasser Arafat in the 90s and early 2000s, or Hamas now, has said no to that. Like, that they don't want Israel to exist, right? And so, I mean, this is incredibly complicated, and I think those are just important things to keep in mind, is that these people don't want Israel to exist. And so that has to play into any kind of discussions we have about what their retaliation should be or what their policy should be in this. So, I don't know where that leaves us, but, I think, by the way, this is one other stat that I think is important to know. So in Israel, I mentioned 20% of the population is Arab, and they have the same rights as everyone else in the country, okay? They have more rights, arguably, than Arabs do in the countries that surround Israel. For example, do you think there's a safe place to be a gay Arab, for example, in Iran? No, there's not. Or in the Gaza Strip, for example. No, you get thrown off of buildings for being gay in some of these places. So it's hilarious to me when I see like gays for Palestine or whatever. I mean, it's kind of like, do you understand what Hamas would do to you if you waved a rainbow flag in Gaza? They would kill you. I think there's just a total disconnect. So anyway, the 20% of the Arabs in Israel enjoy the same rights as everyone else in Israel, right? But do you know how many Jews live in the rest of the Middle East? They make up 12,000 of a collective 580 million people in the Arab countries, okay? That is 0.002%. So there are 10,000 times more Arabs population in Israel than there is Jewish population in the rest of the Middle East. To me, that's all you need to know to understand that this is an Arab versus Jew situation. This is not Israel. This is not oppressor versus oppressed. And by the way, if you zoom out at those numbers, who is really the oppressed person? Who's the minority? It's the Jewish people. Even if you take the entire population, like I said, of Israel, 7 million Jews, and compare that to the 580 million people that live in the Middle East collectively, they're a tiny little percentage. And that's why the left, and I think the anti-Semitic people, the anti-Israel people, they don't want us to zoom out and look at this as like a broader conflict. They want us to look at like, this is just Israel and what they're doing to Palestinians inside of Gaza. That's all they want us to be able to focus on, because if we zoom out, it's very clear to see that Jewish people are the minority in the region, and Israel is the minority in the region as a democracy and as a place with more freedoms than the other countries. And that's why Iran does not want normalization of relations between like Saudi Arabia, who is obviously a more... Look, I've got like plenty of problems with Saudi Arabia too, but they're certainly more diplomatic and they understand their own self-interest, more so. And Jordan's kind of the same way. Egypt is another one where you've got countries that are a little bit more like, this little Iran trying to wipe off Israel off the face of the map does not actually benefit us, because eventually we're going to get caught up in a larger conflict, right? And so it's the Middle East is incredibly complicated. I will definitely talk more about it. But why does this matter to us? Because I'm not going to typically spend a lot of time on this show talking about foreign policy stuff, or at least what's going on in the world. I'm not talking about all the other civil wars that are going on, because I think this one is more directly connected to us than other ones, because Israel's an ally. And I just don't know what happens next. What are we going to do? I feel like we've got Biden, who's certainly, I think his personal convictions are to stand with Israel, but he's playing into the politics of the moment and trying to get reelected in November. And I think he's making more decisions based on the reelection in November than he is for what's actually right and what's the right thing to do, what's the smart thing to do, whether it's popular or not in the United States or with his base. That bothers me, because as a leader, I want a president that does the right thing, regardless of whether it's popular or not, with whether it's his base or reelection. I don't want Biden making decisions. And he's doing this with Ukraine too, by the way. This is the lack of aid to Ukraine when we said we'd back them, I think is morally, it's so morally wrong. We said we'd have their back. We signed a treaty with them in the not a treaty, a sort of deal in the 90s that says, hey, look, if you give up your nuclear weapons, we'll back you. And now, they're floundering because we are not supporting them. And that is absolutely Republicans' fault too. Republicans have not passed this in the House. And this is, as of this morning, the news is that Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, is going to put all three bills for Taiwan, Israel, and Ukraine support all as three different bills with three different votes. We'll see how that gamble works. Maybe by the time this is out, it will have already happened. We'll see. I mean, the Republicans absolutely have a problem here. And if you think Trump is going to be better with Israel than Biden is, I'm not convinced. I think Trump was better. I think there's things that he did, like the Abraham Accords I was kind of shocked the fact that he could get that done. I do think there is a factor that Trump has that Biden doesn't, is that everyone knows Biden's weak and that he will do anything to not escalate a conflict. And I think one upside to Trump, if there is one, is that he is a wild card and changes his mind on an hourly basis sometimes. And so you really can't know what he's going to do in response to an action. I do not think Iran would do what they did this weekend if Trump was the president. I can't prove that, but you look at what their response was to us killing Soleimani, which is basically nothing. And I think you've got to think that they'd go, what's Trump going to do to us if we try to send 300 missiles or drones into Israel? And if they're successful, and I think it would have played more into their calculation. I think they know that Biden was going to tell them not to do it and was going to go tell Israel not to respond to whatever Iran did. And so I'll give Trump that, but that's not exactly a great thing. He's even been telegraphing that he doesn't support Israel as much as I think he did before. And some of that is just because he doesn't like Netanyahu, because he didn't come out and support him and say that his election was stolen. I mean, it's so childish, the things that are going on. But, I don't think we're necessarily any better, but these are important things. We don't want this to turn into a war that we have to get involved in. We don't need a Middle East war between multiple countries. We don't need World War III starting. Obviously, no one wants that. And I think it takes really important. This is the president's most important job. Guess what? The president, based on our Constitution, is not supposed to be fixing the economy. He's not supposed to be promising to get rid of your student debt. He's not, that's not the president's job. But what is the president's job is being our commander in chief and foreign relations. That's absolutely in the president's purview. And I think that we have had a string of people that are pretty bad at it. Trump was much better than I thought he would be, but I think it's mostly because he wasn't interested in it and he delegated it to other people. And so, which, that's great. I'm all for the president delegating stuff. Biden doesn't seem to be so much there. So, I'm not really sure where we go from here, but that's a pretty good way to wrap it up, since I was talking about Trump anyway. And let's talk about Trump's trial that started this week. There's not really a lot to talk about because it's just jury selection going on as of right now. By the way, let's catch you up a little bit. This is the hush money case, as it's commonly called, but really it's a business fraud case that New York Attorney General Alvin Bragg brought. Generally, across the board, the consensus, whether you're on the left or on the right, if you're a legal scholar, everyone says this is the weakest of the four indictments. It's like 90 indictments, but there's 4 cases against Trump. There's this one. There's the documents case of the classified documents that were at Mar-a-Lago. There is the Georgia sort of racketeering mob sort of case of the trying to steal the election. And then there's the federal January 6th and the lead up to it, sort of stolen election stuff that's going on too. So there's two federal cases, two state cases, New York and Georgia. And this is probably the only one that will go to trial before the election in November. So it's the only one. It's the weakest of them. It's honestly the one that I hate, because I think it opened the door for, it was the first indictment that came down, and it's the weakest of them. And to me, it's the biggest stretch as far as it's some very weird legal stuff going on that I'll talk about in a second. And what I think, and what to me that did was, it gave Trump ammunition to say, this is a witch hunt. Look how ridiculous this is. Look, even left media is saying that this is pretty thin ice that the prosecution's standing on. And then that gave them the excuse to say it was the same situation with every indictment that came after that. And I don't think that's the case. I think the documents case is serious. I think that the way he treated our national security was highly negligent in that stuff. And he was clearly trying to cover up having these documents and stuff. I think there's a real case there. I think that's the strongest of them. I certainly think the actions after the election and leading up to January 6th were appalling. The Georgia one, I don't know. The Georgia one's going to fall apart because Fani Willis couldn't, that's a whole thing too. But the point of this one, though, this case, the reason I think it's weak is because the case is that what happened, to catch you up, in case you've not been paying attention, because honestly, it's nice to tune all this stuff out most of the time. But now that we're actually at trial, let's talk about it. So what happened is that Trump had an affair with a porn star in 2006 while his wife had a newborn baby at home. So stand-up guy that you're voting for, if you're a MAGA person, congratulations. You never get to talk about morality again because your guy had sex with a porn star while his wife was at home with their infant child. That's super fun. I'm sure this is really fun for Trump's son who's graduating this year. And I don't like to involve kids in it, but this has got to suck for him to go through, honestly. What's interesting to me is that no one on the MAGA side is saying that Trump didn't have the affair. That's not the defense, is that this wasn't illegal. I kind of agree, because what basically happened is that in lead up to the 2016 election, Michael Cohen, Trump's lawyer, paid Stormy Daniels basically to sign an NDA that said, you're not going to talk about this affair before the election. And then Trump repaid Michael Cohen. So he basically paid Stormy Daniels through his lawyer. And he even gave him enough money to pay the taxes. And he wrote it as legal fees. And this is a personal check from Trump, too. Alvin Bragg, the New York district attorney who ran on, I'm going to prosecute Trump, which to me seems very skewed. It's one thing to say, I'm going to prosecute retail theft. It's another thing to say, I'm going to go after a specific person that you don't like politically. I think that's gross. We can have a whole discussion on that. But the way he's making this work is that, so the technical charge is a misdemeanor charge that is a falsification of business records, because what they're saying, these 32 counts or whatever, is really like, one's the ledger, one's the writing of the check, one's the signing. It was 4 different payments that came from Trump. So he's splitting each one of those is a charge. I think it's a ridiculous overcharging. It's also interesting, this is something that no one else is getting charged with, right? So that's a misdemeanor with a 2-year statute of limitations. And there's some fudging there because like New York couldn't take caseloads in 2020. So they've extended some of the statute of limitations. But the point is, if this happened in 2016, and they didn't bring charges till 2023. If you're counting, that is 7 years, which is 5 years over the statute of limitations for this misdemeanor charge. So what they had to do is figure out a way to make the misdemeanor be a felony. The only way to make that falsification of business records a felony is to connect it to another crime, another felony crime specifically. What Bragg is specifically saying that the crime was like a campaign finance problem, which is interesting because the feds looked into this and chose to not prosecute Trump for campaign finance laws because they said, no, he paid a personal check. There were no campaign funds used for this. So it's not campaign finance. There were no campaign funds used for it. Bragg is trying to say it's a campaign situation because the payment was to positively affect the campaign. I think that's a real stretch because if campaign finance law says he didn't use campaign funds, and by the way, can you imagine the press if he'd used, campaign funds to pay off a porn star? Which, So it's really interesting to me because I feel like the left and the prosecution is trying to have this both ways. They're trying to say this is a felony because it's campaign finance laws, even though he didn't use campaign finances, and he's also trying to make it a business thing. And by the way, New York Attorney General has no right to charge a felony to someone on a federal level. Campaign finance is a federal crime. It is not a local state crime. So I can't figure out how the New York State even has the ability to charge a felony on this, connecting it to a felony that's not within their jurisdiction. Here's my further point in all of this. I think that if you're going to go after a former president of the United States, even one I don't like very much, and who I think is morally reprehensible, and I think did a bunch of shady stuff that I think could be potentially illegally, considered illegal for sure. This is the weakest of all of them because if you tried to explain this, I've been spending the last 5 minutes trying to explain this thing, and I think most people listening are probably tuning out right now, right? Because you're like, wait, I think that you should be able to take, if you're going to prosecute a former president of the United States, I think you should be able to take a demographic swath of the United States, say 10 Republicans, into a room, and I think you should be able to explain the charges and what he did was illegal, and I think you should be able to get half of them to say, yeah, that's illegal. I don't think this is clear enough. I think this is using some real lawfare, kind of like finding obscure laws and finding ways to turn misdemeanors into felonies and blowing past the statute of limitations. Now, one argument on Bragg's side is that they can't prosecute a sitting president, so they had to wait till 2021. Even if the clock started on the statute of limitations right then, keep in mind, 2016, he wasn't president until 2017. You lose a year there. And you lose a year, and so maybe 2022 you could have brought these charges. I would maybe forgive it happening in 2022, but it doesn't happen until 2023 after Trump announces that he's running for president again. And I think that's the real motivation here, and that's what bothers me the most about this is that it seems very political, even though I think what he did was gross. So we're in jury selection for this. They have to dismiss half of the pool because they say I can't be impartial here. I assume that mostly means in a very blue state like New York that they are probably anti-Trump, right? But either way, they've got 7 jurors now. Trump fell asleep the first day in court. I don't think he really realized. I think he's been excited about all this stuff because honestly, it's helped him a lot. It's how he won the Republican nomination is with these indictments. I think that everyone kind of rallied around him because of it. And so I think what you're going to see is that I think Trump's going to be angry that he has to sit in a crappy courtroom for the next however long because the judge has said, you've got to be here unless I say you don't have to be. He's already asked for things like, can I get off for my son's graduation? The judge said maybe. Some things like that, some like specific things that were already planned, and like, can I go to this? And so the judge has not said no to all of that stuff, but he said you need to be here, and he has some really strict rules. Trump has a gag order where you can't talk about specific people or specific details. You can't attack witnesses. What I'm curious to see what happens. The judge has already told the jury pool, none of you should ever reveal your name to anyone. None of you should ever admit to anyone that you were on this jury because the MAGA crowd will come after you violently. And I think that will happen. And I think that this is going to be that's a really sad place to be in, that we're going to sick a whole group, like we're going to attack a juror or because of potentially before they even make up their mind and try to intimidate them. And I will be shocked. I mean, what's the bet right now on if Trump names a juror by name? I'm curious what will happen. I just don't think Trump can help himself. So I think this is kind of a sham trial. I really don't like the charges. I think they're the weakest of all of them. I think they also, like I said, gave excuses for Trump to say the rest of them are as weak as this one when they are not. But I think it's the only trial we're going to get before the election. I don't think any good comes out of this. I'd be surprised. I think if Trump gets convicted on this, I think it's kind of a sham. I would even potentially discount it. Like I said, I'll pay attention. I'll read the details. I'll look into what the specific things are. It's interesting that the star witness is Michael Cohen, who pled guilty to lying to Congress about this whole situation in the first place. So Michael Cohen's not exactly a trustworthy person. that's the star witness in all of this stuff. I'm curious to see what happens, but so far nothing's happened right now because it's just jury selection. I will keep you apprised. I don't think this is going to be the blockbuster thing that everyone thinks it's going to be, though. I think that what we'll end up with is some salacious details. Maybe that's enough to sour some people on Trump. Maybe this does affect the election. We'll see. I'm not really sure. I think what's tricky is that the feds nailed Cohen for the original campaign finance law on the original payment, but it was reimbursed by Trump. I just don't see, it's not clear enough to me who, like I said at the top of the show, I'm a political junkie. I love to read about this stuff. I love to read case details. I love to dive into the details. And if it's confusing for me, and if it's convoluted to me, I just think the American public in general, this is not me saying I'm smarter than the American public. I'm not. I'm just like a nerd I'm willing to pay attention to the details here. And if I'm still going, I don't understand what's going on here, then how is any American going to get the understanding of what's going on from like the 5 minutes that the 6 o'clock news spends on it? I think that this is just going to embolden the Trump base for Trump to be able to say this is a witch hunt, because I think there is some truth to that with this specific case. And I think it's going to embolden the other side to like, look, we've got a criminal that's going to maybe be the president of the United States. And I think this really just turns into which base is going to turn out because of this, but I don't think it changes anyone's mind. I would be really shocked if this trial is going to change anyone's mind. I know we're really early into it, but I think if nothing else, we're just going to hear some details about him having an affair with a porn star, which is gross. It's really, really gross that this is one of the two people that we want to be the president of the United States, that we've already had as president of the United States. And we knew this going into it. We knew he was gross. We know he's a misogynist. We know he has credible accusations against him for rape and assault and stuff. And I just think it's incredibly gross. I think the conservatives, I don't even want to call them conservatives anymore because Trump's completely taken over the Republican Party. I just think the Republicans are going to have to live with the consequences of this for a long, long time. Backing a serial predator, because I think that that's what you just have to look at, and at least serial cheater, because, this is how all of his marriages end. Essentially, he cheats with someone and either marries that person or cheats. I just think it's gross. And I think you can see the demeanor. I don't like to get into the president's family because I think it's not important, but I think it's no surprise why Trump's wife is not around as much. I think, and when you see her, she looks not happy most of the time. I think that she's only in this marriage because, I don't know. I don't want to theorize about that, but it's how could you not be upset at your husband for this, or your dad for this, or whatever? And I just think that it's a really gross situation, and I think it's pretty gross for Republicans, and I think we're going to have to deal with the consequences. This is the party that said we should have held Bill Clinton accountable for his gross behavior, and the left tried to dismiss it as, this is nothing. This is fine. It's his personal life. When he was having sex with an intern at the White House, like a really young, it's really gross in hindsight what Clinton was doing. I knew it at the time. I was in friggin' middle school and knew it was gross. It's even more gross now. And I think that the party that said that was gross will never get to say that about anyone else again if they back Trump in all of this, because it's gross, right? So that's what's going on this week. There's a bunch of other stuff that happened this week. It's a very newsy week, but that's all I got time for today. So thanks for joining me. We'll talk more in the next couple of weeks. I'm going to try to have on some more sort of evergreen topics. We'll talk more about some policy stuff, some education stuff. I'm going to dive into that a little bit more. But we'll see what happens in the news. And thanks a lot for being here. I really appreciate you. And if you can do something for me, it would really help. Love it if you would review the podcast on I want to call it iTunes because I'm that old. It's not iTunes anymore. It's just Apple Podcast. Or on Spotify, you can rate it and just give it a little 5-star thing if you want to, or less, I guess, if you don't like it. But I prefer 5 stars if you can. And you can also tell a friend about this. If you think you have someone that would enjoy the content and some politics without the kind of outrage, pass it along, follow on Instagram and YouTube, and feel free to reach out. I love to chat with you. Email blake@thehomelessconservative.com, or you can reach out on Instagram or YouTube or Facebook @thehomelessconservative. I'd love to hear from you. Love for this to be a two-way discussion. That's it for me, though. I'll catch you next time.